Thank you.
Jeez.
All right, well, why don't I introduce Josh real quick. A little bit of context. Before I joined South Park Commons, I was working on an educational project called the Puzzle School for many years, and followed Josh from afar. We connected briefly a couple of years ago, and Josh was very generous with sharing the materials and work he was exploring. So a lot of really thoughtful stuff going on in his work, and I want to sort of dig into that more. As a little background, Josh is the co-founder and creative director of Synthesis. Additionally, he serves as the executive director and founder of Astra Nova School in Los Angeles. And previously, he was the co-founder of Ad Astra School, located on the campus of SpaceX, and was a Teach for America core member in Las Vegas. Josh, I mean, first of all, thanks for taking the time to chat. I think this is going to be kind of a fun, interesting chat. I would love to hear a little bit more about this sort of evolution from Teach for America up through now Ad Astra Nova and Synthesis. And I know that there's like some themes that have run across that time period. Could you just maybe give a little brief history of your exploration so far?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I remember like very vividly, it was like probably the day before the first day of school, my first year of teaching. So I'm like, 22 years old. You have a classroom. It's like exactly as you remember it, probably. Right? You have a classroom, you have the desks, and as a teacher, your task was setting it all up. And I just remember like the janitor was like in the room, we were just kind of chatting about the year. I was kind of like, what am I supposed to, I didn't say it so directly. I was like, sort of like, what am I supposed to do? Like, how's this going to happen? Basically, like, is it the kids are going to come in and then I'm like on stage essentially? And he's like, well, yeah, it's like your show basically. So it was, didn't feel like my show for sure. And I feel like the first year, there were a lot of those like check-in points, like asking the kids, like, does this feel normal? Does this feel like a real school? Do you like buy that I'm like your teacher? And the thing that I had not quite remembered clearly about elementary school was just like how much time you are alone, like the kids are like with their teacher. So, the school day was like over 6 hours long. We had like a 20-minute lunch and maybe like a 15-minute recess. And then maybe like 4 out of the 5 days, there would be a special. So they'd go to music for like 40 minutes, which was like a great moment of like taking a breath. And it just became really hard to kind of sell the stuff that I was supposed to sell kids, like the worksheets, the like promise of like, if you do this work, then, a great future awaits or college awaits or some like far off goal. And I just started creating a lot of stuff. And it started as just like, I would just create my own math worksheets. I'm not sure that they were any better than the ones that we were supposed to give, but I don't know, it just felt more enlivening to write my own problems. And then I started kind of creating like ethical dilemmas and just like, well, what do you think? One's first of all, just based on reality, like Arctic Wildlife Refuge or something like that. But then, starting to design my own questions that didn't require context, because it felt like a lot of times, like, the students didn't have the context. They didn't know much about oil drilling. Like, why would they? Like, it's not really relevant to kids in Vegas. So I just started designing these questions. And then when I moved to LA, the only school that was really hiring, or the only schools that were hiring, were like private schools. So I ended up at this school called Merman School for Highly Gifted Children. And that's like the actual name. That's not like, that's the name, Merman School for Highly Gifted Children. And I had just expected, based on my experience in Las Vegas and being like an under-resourced, like Title I school, I just expected that a extraordinarily well-resourced school in Bel Air that is private and could truly accept, only students that were at a certain like IQ level, which even at the time I didn't really think was a great way to measure the entrance of your students. I was sort of blown away at how conventional the school was. In fact, I think that they were using the same math books that we were using in Las Vegas. So that to me was like really eye-opening in a way where like I felt less creative freedom at this like private school than I did in like my public setting when I was there for 4 years. So in my second year, well, the first year, again, like the day before the first day of school, my first year there, I see Elon walking along campus, and this is like Elon Musk, like 300,000 followers, Elon Musk, not Elon Musk, Elon Musk. So but I'd seen him on like the Daily Show, and I kind of like knew his story a little bit. So I was like, oh, like that's cool. Like Elon Musk kids go to school here. And that was kind of the sense of the schools. Like there are a lot of like the intellectual folks in LA on the West Side were like sending their kids to Mermin or wanted to. So I didn't meet Elon until my second year. I had one of his students in class and we had like a conversation about basically everything other than his son. It was about, I don't know, some Tesla had caught on fire and he was mad about the media coverage. And we talked about what like the real physical requirements would be to go to space. That we have to be like in great shape, or could anyone go to Mars, that kind of stuff. And a couple of days later, his executive assistant asked that I'd come to SpaceX about a potential opportunity. And that opportunity became starting a school. And really the only guidance was like, well, what do you think about Mermin? And I told him the truth. And then he said, okay, well, why don't we just create something better? And I was like, okay, like, I mean, so of course you have to imagine like all the buildup of like when, from the moment his executive assistant asked me to come to SpaceX about a potential opportunity, and then all of the days and hours leading up to that of wondering like what it would be. And then, being at SpaceX and like walking around and trying not to ask stupid questions, and then getting to the point where he's like, yeah, like I want you to start the school. Like, what do you think? And then being like, yeah, of course, like I'm totally ready to go. And then coming home and telling my wife and my parents, and everyone's sort of blown, like they don't, well, first of all, they're like, okay, well, what are the details? Like where's it going to be? And who are the kids? And what are the ages? And are you like teaching at this school, or are you like the principal? Because like, that you're like a fourth grade teacher, right? Which was kind of humbling in a lot of ways, that like, it felt like the people that love me the most were like, wow, this is like more than, this is probably more than you're ready for. And they were totally right. And yeah, it was just one of those things where like I emailed him at like 4 a.m, like, here's what we should do. We should visit these schools. This is like probably how we should structure it, start small, make it great, and then expand from there. And I didn't hear back from like roughly like November 15th until like January 15th. So you can imagine in that amount of time, just thinking that I'd blown it, but he was too kind to tell me, too polite to say like, hey, like I'm not actually going to have you do this. And arguments with like, I remember like my family, like my mom is so great and optimistic, but she was like, oh, Josh, like I'm sure I'll get back to you. Like, no problem. Like, no, he's not. It's over. Like, it's not happening. Like, I gotta move on. Right. Like I had this chance and I wasn't able to kind of like paint like the right picture for what the school could be. So as things turned out in mid-January, Elon wrote back and was like, hey, like I was super busy. A lot of things came up with the companies. Like, let's make this happen and let's do this. So I finished the rest of the year at Mermin, finished the year out, and meanwhile just started kind of planning for what Ad Astra would be. And then we opened at SpaceX headquarters in the fall of 2014. And then we were at SpaceX for the next 6 years. In Maine for 6 weeks, and then to Gene Wilder's old house that Elon owned adjacent to UCLA for 2 years, and then back to SpaceX on West Campus for kind of the final 4. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of how it all came together.
And then
Yeah.
Now you are doing Astra Nova and Synthesis. And is Astra Nova now like, does Ad Astra still exist, or has it turned into Astra Nova, or what's the connection there?
Exactly. Yeah. So we left SpaceX at the end of this last year in the pandemic. SpaceX is allocating, significant resources to Texas. It felt, Elon's kids had graduated. It was just really time to part ways. So we just continued the school as Astra Nova, same kids, same me, same colleagues. And Astra Nova continues as like a third, well, 5th through 8th grade school, basically, more or less like a middle school, and will be fully online going forward. It's like a nonprofit school. And the idea is that we like look for insights, like try to find, like do good work and then share that work however possible with places like Class Dojo and I guess Synthesis in some ways is like that, but that's just more of a spinoff. So my I guess I have 2 day jobs. One of them is to be the head of school and founder of Astra Nova, and then the other one is like the chief creative officer, creative director, and co-founder of Synthesis, which is a startup that is based on the class that I taught at Ad Astra called Synthesis. So I guess maybe a little context about that. So when Elon Musk asks you to start a school, of course, you feel like an imposter just in general. But I'm also not an engineer. I'm not a physicist. wasn't formally at like Northrop, and now like I was truly like teaching 4th grade. Like I majored in philosophy. Like I don't necessarily have like a technical bone in my body in some ways. So, it's like, okay, I'm going to like run this school. Like, okay, I know how to create like a kind of class culture. I imagine I can extend that to a school culture. I know how to create engaging experiences. I could imagine creating more of those for a school. And so what I started to do is like the things that I had kind of started in Teach for America, kind of like the ethical dilemmas, kind of conundrum type things, kind of like more like simulations. I started calling all of that stuff synthesis. And at first it was just, the kind of the oldest, maybe 7 kids. And as the school grew, it would be more kids. And then eventually we would do, generally synthesis games became teams of 4, 4 teams of 4, basically. So 16 kids that are all playing like a high level simulation. And then just spending more and more time kind of like designing these experiences that would like kind of captivate kids, even if it was only like an hour a week. So my goal was always to design something that was really welcoming in terms of like the rules, because I hate rules, but complex enough that our students were like talking about it throughout the week. And I just did this in like Illustrator and spreadsheets, but it eventually evolved into like just game design, just design like usually games that have an ethical component. And then as much as possible, try to have kids obsess over it, really, like to think about how it could be done better, like think about the teams and the strategy and the deals, and then try to create those good problems where it's like, what is my responsibility as the facilitator or designer of this experience to honor a deal that was made where kids are shaking hands, but only 2 out of the 3 kids shook hands and the third kid like totally disagrees. So it ended up like really like the way that synthesis would look at Ad Astra, it was like 4 glass conference rooms, kids buzzing about, going back and forth, participating in auctions, thinking about strategies, making moves. And then I was just sort of alone. Like sometimes there'd be like a rule clarification, but the kids were like totally running the show. So synthesis, that experience has now spun off into its own startup. We just closed a Series A, a $5 million Series A, maybe like 2 weeks ago. And there's well over 2,000 kids in synthesis in this first year. And it's kind of grown wildly. So it went from this sort of solo endeavor at SpaceX, this class that I was teaching while I was running the school, to now this thing that kids around the world do every week.
It's very cool, and I want to dig in more into the overall philosophy and strategies and how you're getting like that level of engagement. Sounds very fascinating. I am a little bit curious about running a school for Elon Musk's kids. I mean, I think running a school for any wealthy parents' kids would be intense, but was there a good collaboration with Elon? Was he seems to be rather opinionated about this stuff. I mean, how did that go?
Well, I mean, it's like you could read about Elon's childhood and the difficulties in school, and not difficulties academically, of course, but difficulties just socially. And I think, I think it's just fair to say, and I think it's publicly known. I mean, Elon, really cares about his kids, like wants the best for them, but really, is extraordinarily busy. And really, it was like, just make the school great and have the kids want to go to school. And if they love school, then there's all sorts of things they can do. And there's all kinds of other stuff they're going to do anyway to learn. So, I think in that way, I really benefited, especially early on, from not having that kind of, I think he called himself like a nano manager at one point, right? Like, that would have been devastating to the school early on, just because I was figuring it all out and growing into a role that, frankly, everyone around me was like, how long is this going to last? And then, of course, psychologically, that first year, especially, you're just like trying to do everything you can not to mess it. Like, I'm not trying to say that I like did everything I could not to mess it up, but you can still in those first weeks and months feel like, wow, what a shame this would be if we don't even make it through the first year. Then you get to that first year checkpoint, like, all right, well, at least like this was like a year, like that's pretty cool. Like I can always have this year. And then we're like, well, what if we like actually were able to leave the house and make it to SpaceX? Like, wouldn't that be like, that would be a success? And even if it all falls apart, then like that would, and it was like, what if like Elon's kids who were in 3rd grade, like what if we could graduate them to high school? Like, what if we actually like accomplish this mission? So that's kind of how 6 years go really quickly, is that you just are always shocked at how far you've come, and you try not to look down too often. And I think that was one of the things that was really interesting, is that the school always had this natural interest, because people are always, you look at Elon, like Elon education, and you're like, oh, well, Ad Astra, it was like the secretive thing. And for us, it was just like, don't reflect, like, don't do anything to reflect poorly on the company. Like, just stay, or for Elon, like, stay quiet, work really hard, build out like an equity mission, like bring as many kids as possible into the school. It was like about half SpaceX and half kids from like, surrounding areas, and do something worthwhile, because like private schools, I I think that I have a lot of opinions about private schools and what their use can be. And for us, it always felt like sharing good ideas would be a justification for existence. And the other justification for existence when you're a tenant at SpaceX is to, of course, serve SpaceX children, which we were, able to do.
Well, congrats on that successful journey, and it's fun to hear that it started in such an experimental fashion, and you kind of were able to grow it through iteration over those years. I want to mention anybody, if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in chat. I think that's already kind of started a little bit, but we'll get to that as we go. I want to dig a little bit into the sort of overall philosophy here and that iterative approach and what you've learned along the way. I mean, you mentioned getting kids to engage in an obsessive manner, and I feel like at some level, like that's just the secret sauce to any educational experience, like young people really caring about it. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about what the components are that you discovered along the way that were most meaningful to that experience for the young people.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, like memories from school are extracurricular sports stuff, quirky teachers that drive, I remember my biology teacher dressed up like as a mitochondria. And I remember that being like, curious. But in terms of like deeply formative moments, like I just can't think of so many, but when I do think of them, like they're very powerful and continue to shape the way I think about things now. So I guess from like that first principles perspective, it was like, what would be the moments that we could create in school that would stay with you and be the building blocks of whatever your future might look like? So it felt like in order to do that, of course, like students have to be at the center of that. They have to be the ones that are doing like the heavy lifting, grappling with the challenges, and having that opportunity to reflect on like tough decisions that they make, especially when those decisions, it's not even so much that they have to be like not the right decisions, but like inevitably they're not going to be the best decisions. And I think just having like the space to reflect on those. So I think that was just from a design perspective, just starting a school with like no excuses. Like Elon does not care about accreditation, did not care about, what other schools do it this way. It was basically all those were like ways to get fired. To be like, well, like, the school down the road does it this way, or well, every other school does, languages, so we should do those too. Like reasoning by analogy is like the fastest way to not be part of that world. So to think of it in that way, like what are the experiences that are going to be most formative, they're going to stay with you? Where can we make sure that students doing the heavy lifting? Where can we create space for students as collaborators? Like where could we surrender our egos to design something where like we actually like need students to evolve faster? I think that that's been a great lesson at Astra and now at Synthesis. And I think also just, we know that like if kids love school and it's a place that they like want to be, that there's just so much more that you can get out of it. And so much of it was just sort of like unlearning our natural tendency to just give kids hints or to make things like easier for them because our own egos were tied into them like reaching a finish line that we had set. So much of it was just like, okay, well, yeah, like the insight into how to best play the synthesis game is right there in front of you and you're so close to it. But I see you struggling and like it's hard to watch you struggle, but I have to let you struggle because otherwise it will be like this empty victory or empty insight. So I think a lot of that sort of stuff, I didn't necessarily know at the time, but because like when we didn't do it that right way, we were just creating that kind of debt over time where it's like, wow, like we are really just kind of giving in to whatever is like most expedient for our kids, just kind of make sure everything is like smoothed over. And a lot of that ended up with parents. I think there was a little bit of bravado with admissions, which we just borrowed from Elon and SpaceX, which was, we don't need your family here. And not because we don't think your kid is amazing or that you're committed parents, but we are fortunate in this like kind of 1 in a million situation to only accept families who like raise children that are kind and like are eager to take on challenges and understand that this is just not some like stopping place on your way to like Stanford or like Harvard Westlake is like the fancy high school in LA. And I think to do it in that way, we were able to find kind of the right community of people that were open to this kind of experimentation. Of course, at SpaceX, you're already getting like some of that. But for those that weren't part of SpaceX, I would start, like admissions. So admissions is always funny because you have these parents, everyone's kind of nervous, everyone shuffles in. They've read a little about the school. It's at SpaceX. They use flamethrowers, which is not true, but they're always like kind of crazy sensationalist stories written about the school. But they would come in and everyone sits, the parents sit down and they have like their notepads out of their like iPads and they're ready basically to take notes to evaluate, like, is this school the real deal? Is this even like worthwhile? And rather than perform, I would ask them to engage. And what I would do is I would just say like, all right, here's a question. You have $1 trillion to invest in the best possible future. Here are 9 categories. There's like invest in the arts and basics, the environment, exploring frontiers of the physical universe, artificial intelligence, all the 9 things. And you can only give the money in $100 billion increments. So, everyone's kind of like, oh my God, like everyone's, you see the awkwardness, right? The shuffling, the like, oh my God, like, do I have I have to like write this out? And it's so interesting. So then everyone then proudly will share what their formulation is. And more often than not, the adults would hedge, right? They would give $100 billion to 8 causes and give $200 billion to the 9th cause. And like, all right, I solved it. It's done, right? Everyone gets what they want. And then like the thing that was so fun was then to say like, but really, do you think that this would create the best possible future? Like $100 billion to cities? Like, what does that even mean? Like you basically prosecute them for answering a question without asking more questions about the question. So in that way, I think we were successful in creating the right tone of what we were trying to do, which was not to just be comfortable or self-satisfied or just be some way station on the way to like, I guess like fancier places. It had like a real ethic to it in a way that it would strike you as this is scrappy. Like this is like a scrappy thing. And the articles that were written about the school made it sound like it was elegant. But I don't know if anyone's ever been to SpaceX or been near it, like SpaceX is not elegant. Like you go into the headquarters and it's like, it blows your mind because of just kind of how it all works, but it's inelegant. You go into the closets or the back alleys or just the surrounding campus. Like they're throwing it together. They're like converting old warehouses and old cafeterias into rocket factories. So anyway, that's probably like the biggest surprise in terms of people joining the school.
And is that example you just provided for the parents, is that the same type of thing you would give to the kids, or is that, a different complexity?
Yeah, the kids had already answered that question, and we'd already kind of discussed it. So then one of the great accommodations to that question is say that you can't repeat any dollar amount. So the most causes you could get to would be 4. So 100, 200, 300, 400 billion. And that's when the real squirming happens. And that's when like the intra-family argument starts happening. It's like, you're going to give $800 billion to frontiers. Are you kidding me? Like there are people that, so that's the stuff that I personally live for. I just love, I love constructive disagreement. I love creating questions that have enough openness that allow you to imagine. Like, I want to ask a question where I'm going to give you the options because I want to force you into actually like sticking to one of them, but I want to create enough openness in the question that you could imagine maybe a better solution than the options presented. So this work is now something called Conundrums, which is a partnership with Class Dojo. So I wrote with students these first 14 conundrums, and we released them in March and had like 1 million views in the first month, which is really cool. So for the first time, I think, not the first time, but hopefully, well, that's not true. Maybe for the first time, a lot of students, especially at younger ages, were asked a question where there was no right answer, and they were in an opportunity to disagree with their teacher. And that was like should have been seen, hopefully was seen as a positive thing. So yeah, like a quick example of this would be, all right, so there's this animal called the Novaru, and in its home country, it's celebrated, it's on the currency, it's on the national flag. It's like truly a huge part of their tourism industry and a huge part of their cultural identity. Their neighboring country, in the cover of night, over many years, starts planting the Novaru's favorite plant just across the border. And, one day the Novaru, which is just, of course, only live in like a small pack, hop across the border and are now in the neighboring country. The question is, what should happen next? Should they be returned to the neighboring country or to the home country, or should they remain in the neighboring country? So again, like a question like that, it's like illustrated and animated, and then the ability then for students to weigh in and then to collect the data and talk about what it all means, and then to maybe change your mind, which would be a great thing. And then have your teacher take a step, ideally out of the room, but at least take a step away from just being the person who's leading the conversation. And I've been really encouraged by the feedback on Conundrums. And what's great about Class Dojo is that they're in all types of schools all over the world. And we're working on season 3, 4, and 5 right now. So that's just an example of doing good work at Ad Astra for a school that was of like 50 kids and finding ways to share it with many more. And of course, as always, you have to be really conscientious of what's a product of real ingenuity and creativity, something that's worth sharing versus like, are they just sharing this because we're associated with Elon? So there's a lot of those sorts of questions that are always kind of haunting me, but I do think the feedback you know, if you're a teacher, like you don't really care if it's Elon's kids or not, like, or Elon's school or not. You just want engaging stuff for your kids.
Yeah, I would recommend, I think astronova.org is the website. You can actually see a lot of the videos for the conundrums up there, and they're short, but they give a nice glimpse into this sort of style of like inspiring critical thinking in young people. I mean, I'm wondering, are there any constraints you run into? I mean, like, does a conundrum ever fail, like for any reason? Is it too complex or not, or boring or whatever? I mean, like, is there any reason, or is it just kind of like any style of question in this style works basically?
Well, this next season, I think some will fail. They're a little. I think I've gone a little. The problem is, right? Class Dojo's target audience is like second grade, third grade. That's like their peak, and that's like those are our youngest kids. So you write a conundrum, even like the most simplistic ones. All of us could have like a good conversation about what it would be. I think they can fail when you try to do too much, like try to give too much of a narrative. Like you got to keep it kind of open-ended. It should be like 1 minute. I should be able to explain to you the parameters of the narrative and then give you the kind of the basic options. Even if you're like, well, I wish I had this other option, that's probably usually the compromise option, which by design I leave out. So yeah, I think this structure of questioning is actually really helpful. I don't see it so often in schools. I mean, I remember with not creative writing, but with persuasive writing, it was always like school uniforms, no school uniforms, that kind of stuff, just kind of irrelevant, frankly. Like you want to give more of the shades of gray. But yeah, that style of questioning is really effective, I think, for all ages. We're doing this
And
stuff anyway. It's just making it like in schools. Yeah.
if you're, I mean, as you expand out, I mean, what does the next 10 years look like for Astronova and Synthesis and all of these sort of threads? I mean, do you just continue to push in this direction? Do you see other areas that feel just as promising?
It's a good question. I mean, it's the two worlds have collided, but yet like the difference in what I do for each is just growing further apart. You know, it's kind of crazy to go, you're like in a parent teacher conference, and then the next I'm like meeting with an engineer about like design things. Then I'm talking to Chris, the CEO, about, you know, how are we going to hire, you know, X number of dozens or hundreds of teachers in the next year based on growth. Like it's a lot of that. And I love it. I just love like bouncing around between it. As it relates to Astronova, I feel like Astronova should only exist if we continue to generate insights like conundrums and synthesis and some other things, right? Like if we're not generating insights, I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know that it's so, if we're not generating insights, I'm not sure that it's so different than what else is out there that we should continue to exist. So that's like my thought with Astronova. And then for synthesis, I think it's always, because it's Silicon Valley, because it's a startup, because we raise money, it's like, this is the future of education. It's like, for me, the success of synthesis is that synthesis become a recognized thing that all kids need in their education. And whether it's called something different, I don't really care. Whether the company itself provides it, not really, that doesn't matter as much to me. I want this sort of like collaborative problem solving to be that indispensable part of every kid's education. And like, that's the thing that I want to fight for. And it's, I think step one is naming it, that people are like, okay, this is a thing called synthesis and this is what it means. Students in control, problem solving, collaboration, and like deep reflection. How do we do that? Primarily through simulations/games. Why? Because you will have profound experiences likely that will stay with you. And sometimes they're like maddening and you're frustrated and you want to scream at your teammates. But like, again, the fact that you have emotion for an educational experience is a positive thing to be celebrated. So in terms of the future, I mean, I don't know. A year ago, we were just sorting through leaving SpaceX. And I told Chris, you know, there's no way I'm starting a company. First of all, I don't consider myself to be like creative, but maybe not entrepreneurial. And, you know, persistence sometimes wins out, and it did in this case. And now all of a sudden, I'm trying not to look down.
Yeah. Got a lot of great questions coming in. I do want to ask sort of one larger question real quick. I mean, I don't know, let's say you're Secretary of Education tomorrow. I mean, how does synthesis fit in with the traditional education paradigm? I mean, do you throw it out in your opinion? Is it supplemental? Is it, I mean, you have a magic wand. How do you change public schooling in America based upon your experiences so far?
It's impossible. Well, it's not impossible. I think what I would try to do, at least specifically, this is so hard. I don't know.
Sorry.
I mean, it's so hard. It's rightfully difficult, right? It's incredibly difficult. What public schools have to put together, and like the challenges they face are immense. And I, if I've ever been critical of public schools in the past, like it's tremendously difficult. Like it's then that when I came to Merman, like that's when it was like, like in fact, it's almost like a promising thing. It's like, wow, like even the fanciest schools are still wildly conventional. So the opportunity to do something unique in public schools and to experiment and to do something like it's a fancier environment, but it's not like a holistically different experience in terms of like intellectual rigor, at least in my mind. What I would do is I would try to find a way to make things like synthesis more the core of what you do. And now, of course, like when it comes to reading, I mean, specifically literacy and numeracy, like those are two hugely important things as well. I mean, I would try to basically divide the day between things like synthesis and literacy, numeracy, kind of at your level, but I don't know, kind of the things that people have done. I don't think I have great insights in terms of those two things. And then, you have the branches that go off, like, I just think it's crazy that we spend the same amount of time for all subjects for the most part. And you're not allowing kids to really specialize at an early age when they like really love something. But I feel like, you could design synthesis experiences in so many different areas in so many different ways that would like speak to just different kids. And the most important thing, of course, is that students are in power, like that they make the choice, they make the decisions, and they can succeed or not succeed in that simulation based on the experiences that they make. But that's like not the whole point. So there is no magic wand, of course, but I just can't, like, as much as I'm fighting to get conundrums for like just 10 minutes, like once a day or once a week. I mean, what if this was more part of what we did? It would totally change the power structure of schools. But I think that we can no longer with a straight face say that if we follow all the rules of school, that will beget, great outcomes for like most students in this country. And that is the fact that we can't say with a straight face. It's like bordering on like a lie. So we should probably move away from that and start, designing experiences where students are first. That's what I would do. I mean,
yeah. I feel like that's a very reasonable observation. Unfortunately, it's incredibly complicated to move beyond that observation, but it's true. I want to give people a chance to ask questions. I've got a few myself, but want to make sure we have time for some of these audience questions. Ashley, I think this was you were the first one here. Do you want to ask yours? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. No, I was just wondering, you mentioned in the beginning that you had kids yourself, and it sounded like maybe somewhat recently. Was just wondering how old they were and when did it start kind of like affecting your vision or mission statement or curriculum for the school?
I have a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old, and I don't know. I don't fret about school for them because they're fortunate, right? My wife is a learning scientist. Like, I run schools. I'm not worried about them, not because I have the answers, but just because I just know that they're so fortunate that like, I'm not worried that like whether we go to the school down the street or they went to a private school, I feel like it's all the same. So for me, it's like, okay, what are the experiences that I can give them where they can start to learn their own lessons and feel like then when they see complexity, they're like magnetized towards it, or they see like difficulty or a problem or a challenge. And that's the thing that excites them. So for me, like, that's it. Like, how do I create the conditions such that they grow with a humbleness and generosity and kindness, that they have experiences with all types of different people that are, but passionate people as much as possible, that like care about whatever it is that they do, what they care about. And then to be like, to humbly recognize complexity in all forms across all industries and in all places. So if those are like the 2 or 3 things that I care about, it's just creating the conditions for that. So I don't worry, because like school in some ways they're just not going to find that stuff in school really. So I think it's just on me as a parent to figure out with my wife, like how we can figure out that stuff elsewhere. But does it change? Yeah. I mean, Astra Nova is a fully online school because I just can't, now that we've been home for this last year, I just can't bear to be driving, 2 hours a day to be in a place with someone else's kids. So this is the only way to do it, is then to be like a fully online school. And we're fortunate that Astra Nova has interest from around the world. So it's not tremendously difficult to get the admissions numbers where we need them to be. But yeah, I can't bear to be gone 5 days a week and just not see the kids grow up, because there's no, with now synthesis being this other thing that requires like, full-time work, I just simply can't do both if I need to be physically somewhere for that much time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Sharon, do you want to do your question?
Sure. Thanks for speaking to us today. It was so interesting. I've got a few questions. You don't have to answer all of them. You should give everyone time. So they all relate to kind of like the synthesis and Ad Astra sort of philosophy. So the first question is with respect to like parent education, because kids spend so much time at home, right? So if we're trying to encourage complexity, trying not to feed them the answers, like I'm curious about how you kind of bring along the parents with you to complement that development of the children. The second question is with regards to sort of your approach to like kids' innate intelligence. Intelligence, it can be nurtured, it can be innate. I don't understand it, but I'm curious what you think about how important it is to kind of like surround really smart kids with other smart kids in order to like develop together. Is that something that needs to be considered? And I don't know, and how like undemocratic could that be as well? And I think that question is more in terms of like, how do you know if it's working? So I hear you about trying to empower kids and putting them in the center of the experience. I think that that's something that's very clear. But I wonder whether or not how important it is for that to like translate into real world accomplishments. Like when kids grow up, or even when they're really young, like do we see them tackling complex problems that, I don't know, like civilization or society is facing, and actually doing that problem solving? How do you know if it's working, and is that important?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. I'll start with the last one, I think. Yeah, like we want this generation of kids to be more efficacious, ethical problem solvers than we are, right? Like we need that, right? That's to progress, and to progress at an accelerating rate. Like that's what we need to have happen. So, all right. So we all believe that. I think everyone believes that. So if we all believe that, then what are the experiences that they're going to have between, name the age till they're adults or throughout adulthood, that will give that a better chance of happening? So my answer to that, my own small mind, is like synthesis. Like rather than spend 180 days a year and 6 hours a day rolling through like place value for the 1,000th time, what if we did things that would give them exposure solving novel problems, and doing so in a team, because we know that collaboration is king, and that's how we are able to be superhuman. So that's that. And like, how do I measure its success? Like it will be ultimately the people that these children become. How much of that will be owed to synthesis? I can't say. I guess when they're being asked in some future talk or whatever, like, what is it that changed the way that you think about the world? I hope that some of those kids say, like, of course, like being part of synthesis changed the way that I thought about like the power that I have, like what I'm able to do, how I'm able to think about my place in a problem and my role in a problem. And to know that like, it's not, yeah, like, I think that that's unique too, is that the role, what is your role in a team? And I think that that's something that just, there aren't many conversations about that. In terms of like smart kids around smart kids, I mean, this is just a tough question to answer. When we do admissions for Ad Astra and Astra Nova, we almost always say the first thing is like kindness. Like we're looking for kindness, because it's just the thing that's the most disarming to parents, because they're expecting like excellence or brilliance or whatever else. And then really what we just look for is commitment. I've been using the word commitment a lot in synthesis, and I'm going to use it a lot here, just talking about Astra Nova. It's like, we're just looking for kids that are committed. And I don't really mind like what you're committed to, that you just, there's something that you're drawn to, and you like show that you are like willing to do like the hard work to do more of it. And hard work can just be finding the time to do it, or convincing your parents to let you do it, or, raising money to get the resources to build it, or whatever that is. So it's just like kindness and commitment. And I find that when you have kind and committed kids together, regardless in a lot of ways of like intellectual capacity, that like really special things can happen. So we don't do IQ tests at Astra Nova. We get sent them all the time. Parents think that that's like the math. Look, like it's like IQ of 150. It's like, great. That's probably the easiest way for us to have some concerns about you as a family. And I just think that that's the right way to do it. And, would the school, I don't know. That's the way that we've done it. And I have to say, like, there have been students, a year in, where like, I don't know if this student, like, this must be difficult being around some kids that are just so advanced, but you know what? It's amazing how that all happens. Like it's just not linear. Like child development is not linear. You see huge leaps that kids make. We are consistently humbled by the last student that we admit in a particular class. And we're like, I don't know, like this is kids on the borderline, and they come like, they're far and away like the strongest student and like best citizen and all that. And other times there are kids that we like don't accept for like 2 or 3 years because again, like we're a small school, we just don't have that many spots. We're not trying to be selective. We just have to be. And then that kid will, the third year, we're like, all right, like let's just let him in. Like what's the, and of course, like that kid just flourishes. So again, like commitment. And I think that that's a really important thing. And then your first question had to do with, can you remind me?
Teaching parents, like bringing
Oh,
parents.
honestly, this is going to sound mean. We we actually keep parents out of it in a lot of ways. What we hope to hear after a child's first year at Astra Nova is that, wow, like my kid is handling their responsibilities in like the school in a way that's like a little shocking. Like they just seem to have it. And we like kind of knowingly are like, yeah, like that's great. That's kind of what we hope to hear. So much of schools, it's like there's betrayal of kids some ways, right? It's like schools communicate directly to parents. Like we'll have a conversation that we will not have with the student. And I hate that. I've always hated that. I hated that as a kid, and I've hated it as an adult and as a teacher. So we just try to be like really honest and straightforward with students. And sometimes we enlist parents to support, certain things, but for the most part, a lot of it's just opt in. Like if you don't want to do it, like then, I mean, we're not giving you grades, like, like, yeah, I mean, if you want to go to like a selective high school, they're going to ask us for some evaluation of how well you're doing, but that's fine. Like that's your choice. So I think that like non-coercive environment with just that celebration of learning and like being exposed to all types of people that are just committed to what they love to teach, that it just kind of creates a culture of like wanting to take on those responsibilities and kind of to appreciate others' gifts as well as your own. So in terms of parents, like we don't do any parent education other than, we meet and kind of have like strategic talks where we share, just as it's important to bring students in to talk about like the strategic vision of the school, to write conundrums, be part of it. It's important too to bring parents in and just be vulnerable. Like just tell, like, we don't know. Like when we were, we left SpaceX, like, I don't know what next year is going to look like. And we, like, this is what we're thinking. And this is like, we're going to try to make happen. And you can trust that we're going to do everything we can to make it work. And I think that vulnerability just speaks well, because then you're not in a position where you're disingenuous or you're shielding yourself from being found out, I guess, because you're not really shielding yourself. It's just you're exposed the whole way. So those would be my answers to those questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking.
Perva, I don't know if you're available to ask. I'm happy to ask the question as well, but give you a second. Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can ask. Thanks, Josh. This is a really great conversation. The question I have about Ad Astra and also synthesis, the concept is so novel and it seems so powerful, but I'm wondering about affordability, particularly when it comes to synthesis. How did you decide on pricing? $180 per month seems really steep for many families. So how do we make it affordable for underserved families?
Great question. So Astra Nova is full sliding scale tuition. So whatever your family could pay, from $0 to $31,500. If anything, we should make it more expensive, so families that have the ability to pay more. So about 50% of our students are in some level of financial aid, and that will be, right now, I would say it's nearly blind in terms of, so like a student would apply and we'd have no idea what their financial situation is, and we would accept them, and then whatever they can pay is what they pay. Because we are entirely on our own financially, for the first time this year, we weren't able to fully make it blind. We had to at least we have to make sure the lights can stay on. But eventually, yeah, we'll be able to do that. And part of the financial model for Astra Nova is to not accept any money from wealthy donors, because I don't know. I think it's just, we should be able to run it in a really lean way where we can have students that pay full tuition and students that pay no tuition, and we can make it work. Now, it'll always be skewed until we figure out some other model, because yeah, if you can pay $30,000 a year for your kids' independent school education, you are certainly in like the upper percentage of 1%, right? In terms of synthesis, I think we started thinking like, okay, how much would you pay for kind of like an hour plus of synthesis a week? Like, oh, maybe like as much as a piano lesson, I don't know, $30, $40 a session. In a month, you have maybe 4 sessions or 5 sessions, 160, 200, let's say 180. And we just haven't really changed it. Part of that's because like demand has been so high that we just haven't changed it. But what will happen, I believe, is like we will start moving towards a free or extremely low cost version of synthesis. And probably ideally, I mean, ideally, but probably there'll be a version of synthesis that's kind of at this price point or maybe a little bit above. But the goal would be that in like the lower price synthesis experience, it would still be access to the network and the community and everything else. It would just be acknowledging the things that are really expensive to provide, which is like the mentorship, like the one-on-one stuff. And I would like to find a way that that sort of thing could be provided locally, because really there are some things, just like the questioning technique of conundrums, there are things in terms of mentorship and reflection, some of it enabled by technology, that can be done without, needing, a one-on-one conversation. So we're working through all that. Obviously, it's incredibly important to me that synthesis is for everyone. If we're going to accelerate human progress, like we have to make sure that we have, all kids represented. But yeah, right now it's more expensive than we'd like it to be, but that's definitely something that keeps me up at night. That's a great question, though. Thank you for asking it.
Nadia was next, but I think her internet's having some issues. So I'm going to try to frame her question a little bit. I think it's mostly around just going out and raising money for synthesis. Did that change the equation for you compared to like Ad Astra, Astra Nova? I mean, there's clearly a very different stakeholders involved with fundraising and VCs and everything like that. Was that you just kind of out of the box? You were able to kind of just get them on board without changing anything?
Yeah, it's just again, tremendous advantages, like because of the story, I guess my story, and because of all of it, it was not particularly difficult in this financial climate to raise money. And Chrisman, the CEO, was really adamant that we raise money from angels and do it in a way where we're not giving up large amounts of the company, not giving up any board seats. We're maintaining as much control of the company as possible, and looking for people that have networks that would be able to give things to the company and to help us grow and to give us advice and share with their network what we're trying to do. So we didn't take any VC money. And I think that, and I agree with Chris, like that's like the new model. It's find people with influence who are really committed to what you're trying to do and leverage them to help you grow grow your business. So financially, yeah, I mean, it was pretty different. It's a pretty different world. I'm still sort of shocked that we can raise millions of dollars by filling out a Notion card with some financials and a story. But, at the same time, like I spent, I don't know, 8 years, like trying to make really engaging student experiences. And, I hope other people do the same thing. I guess early on, we're like, what if people copy synthesis? Like, great. Like if there's better educational experiences for kids, fantastic. Like I'm only supportive of that. I think so often ed tech companies sometimes start without like an insight. And I feel like we've been fortunate that we have an insight, which is like the thing that I've described. And now it's just a matter of like building a network that's strong enough to support students in that growth. And of course, broadening who it's available to, because if we don't do that, then it's just like kind of like a nice to have, but it's not going to change education or certainly human progress.
Yeah. Sharon, I'm going to skip around a little bit just to make sure that people have a chance to ask. William, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I've got a quick one. So did standardized testing have any place in the education? I know there's sort of some pushback on that. And then I additionally wanted to add that this sounds like the educational experience I dreamed of my entire life as a kid. So I'm super glad that you're out here getting it done. And I'm glad that critical thinking has a place in education rather than just telling us to memorize whatever the hell they told us to memorize. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, appreciate it. God, I wish they could have that time back, right? One of the questions with admissions was like once, like, everyone walks in, it's like, what % of your education was well spent? It's kind of amazing. There's someone in the audience like 100% because it got me to where I am. It's like, okay, fair enough. But really, like, did you need to be memorizing like all that stuff, right? Science felt like just memorizing definitions of words. In terms of standardized tests, I don't know. I just think it's crazy that we have. I don't know. I'm not going to answer this question well. I'll just give that preface. I think the problem is that we talk about parent obsession with getting into selective schools, but that's not everyone. That's actually not even most. That's like a very small subset are like obsessed with getting their kids into like the top schools, and increasingly are finding that difficult to come by. But unfortunately, because college admissions has been the way that they are, and people are kind of guessing what admissions officers are wanting, you're having entire childhoods that are being taken over, doing all sorts of things that otherwise would never be done if that was not the end goal. So you're trying to find weird, like I'm gonna have my child take Russian, like not because you care about the language or the culture, because like you think that will look different, that sort of thing. But then I think for most people in this country who send their kids, of course, to public schools, who just want like a better future for their kids, that's the real problem in my mind. It's just that like you're just not going to get that experience in your K-12 education that's going to matter. And at the end of it, you're going to standardize tests, which is like sort of, I don't know, half IQ test / half like academic mastery of the concepts that you were supposedly taught in high school, that then will therefore indicate how well you'll do in this thing called college, which, as we know, is highly variable depending on where you go and what it all is. And anyway, it's all to say that like I don't know what the role of standardized tests are. I don't know in terms of like the role of sort of like, certainly standardized tests have some use in fields like medicine and everything else. But again, I can't speak to that at all. I just know that I interview lots of really smart people for both companies, and that did, I'm sure, extraordinarily well in their SAT or ACT, and I would never hire them, because if I did, that it's a greater chance that the companies would collapse. So yeah, I'm a little trepidatious when it comes to pedigree as it relates to standardized test scores and actually universities as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for the bad answer, but
Michael, I don't know if you're available to ask your question, but I'll jump in. I think the question is basically just around direct to consumer, if you're working with schools at all, like school packages.
Direct to consumer, maybe schools someday, but it's hard and takes a lot of time. And I mean, the real question is like, what's the role of software in synthesis? Because the hard part is that because we're having students play games, which feels very natural to them because they're playing games all the time, that they learn the games and pick up the games like quicker than the adults. Like I had a group of Astra Nova kids play a group of even like just a little bit older kids, like Berkeley masters in engineering students, and Astra Nova kids crushed them. And not, that wasn't like, there were some variants, but really like Astra Nova kids just sort of, they're where the Berkeley kids are like afraid of like new rules and like in the game and like, am I smart or how's this going to look? The Astra Nova kids are like, whatever, like, no problem, just sort of throwing themselves into it. The real question as it's a synthesis is like, what is the role of the adult? Is the role of the adult to facilitate, to sort of just keep, keep the collaboration piece there and kind of the guardrails of it? Or is there like more like teaching and connecting that can happen? My sense is that the future of synthesis will be that like low cost or free version will be the games and experiences themselves, which will have moments of reflection and touch points and sort of like the kind of the motivation piece, ideally, whether it's through video or something else. And then on the back end, the reflection piece will still probably mostly be done by adults, but could still probably be done in some ways through software. But the problem is that it's artificial, this idea that the adults hold the secrets to the game because they've been trained on the game. And then we try to prevent them from giving the secrets of the game to the kids. Like, it's a really silly way of doing it. Like, really the best way, most authentic way to do it is have the adult in that room learn that game or be exposed to the game at the very moment that students are. And then that vulnerability and that just openness to like, you're trying to figure it out too, helps you understand and empathize with how important it is that you try to understand what the truth is as it relates to the game, rather than you are in a position of power and you just sort of get to smugly like decide whether or not they're on the right track, or like, oh, that's right. Or, oh, did you notice this thing? That stuff has to end. So that's one of the big questions as it relates both to scale, because it's of course really difficult to hire a cadre of hundreds of teachers. And also in terms of design, like, can we do it in a way where students come together from around the world and like there needs to be just minimal adult intervention to do an educational experience. So those are things that we're thinking about.
We're out of time. I have a little visitor in the background here. She's actually going to be doing synthesis, I think, later this summer. So
awesome.
So I hope she has fun with it. But Josh, I wanted to thank you for your time. I think Josh is generally very generous with his time. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to him directly. But really appreciate all the effort you're doing here, and I hope to take advantage of it myself someday. Abby will as well. So
Hey, thanks for spending your time tonight, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks for reminding me, Jared. It's really cool. Thanks.
A lot of fun. All right. Thanks, everybody.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.